My Friend Flicker by Mary O'Hara. Chapter 11. The week that followed, during which Ken was to choose his yearling, was a busy one for everybody. It rained every day out of one big purple cloud which drifted away at night, so that the mornings came in hot and clear, but by noon it was over the ranch again and would start to rumble, then shiver and crack with lightning. Then the downpour of rain, while the horizons all around were calm and blue, with fleecy white clouds motionless upon the hills. Nell called it the Goose Bar sprinkling system. It brought out the strong, fresh colours of the flowers, dark salmon geraniums in the ultramarine blue window boxes, and red, pink, purple and white petunias in the flower border. The roofs of the buildings were red and clean, with no dust on them, and the grass as green as a billiard table. The boys were riding Lady in Calico and Buck and Baldy, the horses that were being trained to rent for the rodeo. When you're hunting for Rocket and looking over the yearlings and chasing the geldings, you might well be training these plugs, said McLaughlin. Which shall we ride? Asked Howard. McLaughlin, stretched out in a chair on the terrace with his pipe just before supper, gave this careful thought. Now, let's see. Lady's nervous, and she runs away. Went over backwards with Tim last week. Baldy, stubborn brute, argues with you, but he's always right. More sense than a man. Calico, a running fool. Never knows when to stop. Wears himself out. Howard, you take Calico, and don't forget for a moment that he hasn't got sense. He'll be in a lather over nothing. Too willing. His mouth's hard. Don't encourage him to lean on the bit. Hold him in, but don't carry his head. Talk to him a lot. He'll quiet down for the voice better than anything else. Ken, you take Lady. I'm giving her to you because most of the time you don't know where you are. You sit like a sack of meal. Almost forgot to hold the reins. She'll not know you're on her back. I've noticed, when you're on her, she's never gathered. Goes about as if she was grazing. It's a good thing. Good for that mare, anyway. Eases her down. But watch out for her running away. Just don't let her get going too fast. When she does, it suddenly comes to her that she'll take the bit and run away. Kind of goes to her head. I want to break her of that habit this summer. She's a fine horse. I'll help with Lady too, said Nell. She always behaves well with me. I love to ride her. We understand each other. Okay. As a matter of fact, you could ride any of them, and it would be a good thing to change about. Any of you could ride Buck and Baldy. No use telling you what to do with Baldy. He'll do what he pleases, but it'll usually be the right thing. He won't object to orders unless they're unreasonable, and Buck needs a lot of suppling, and he's not as bridle-wise as he should be. Take them down into the practice field and do figure eights on them for an hour every other day. Just get them a bit quicker at answering the aids, more up and coming. Practice starts on the trot and the canter. Use saddles, groom them before and after. Now remember, boys, this will be a daily duty for you. Don't forget it or neglect it, and I don't want to have to watch you or bother about it. You can keep the 4 of them in the calf pasture. They'll be handy to get at and won't get mixed with the other horses. Give them all the riding you can. A Colorado buyer, Joe Williams, came to see if McLaughlin had any horses to sell. He came once or twice every year, collecting horses that he afterwards sold at the local auctions. But the prices he offered were so low that his appearance at the ranch was always the signal for Rob McLaughlin to lose his temper. Williams offered $35 or $40 for an old broodmare with her spring colt, $20 or $30 for an old gelding broke for saddle, and work provided his teeth were good enough to keep him in flesh. But as he paid cash down, and the only other way of getting anything at all for horses that were not fit for good markets was to ship them to the glue factory in a carload of old plugs and wild broncs dragged in off the range. McLaughlin, after hours of argument, loud words and insults, usually made a deal with him. Nell always urged him to. After all, she said, they're only getting older, and it's hard to keep them in condition, and he can get 8 or 10 of them into his truck, and even at his prices, that means a couple of $100. On this occasion, McLaughlan said that he'd get in some horses that were useless to him from his outlying pastures, and they'd make a deal. And Williams drove away, promising to be back inside of a week with his truck. Jingo, one of the 2-year-olds, died. McLaughlan never allowed anyone to show or even to feel any grief about the death of the animals. It was an unwritten law to take death as the animals take it, all in the day's work, something natural and not too important. Forget it. Close as they were to the animals, making such friends of them, if they let themselves mourn them, there would be too much mourning. Death was all around them. They did not shed tears. But Jingo, the way he would come up behind you, nipping your shoulder, asking for attention, Ken could not forget him easily. Gus tied a rope to the dead horse's head and fastened it to the back of the little Ford truck and hauled him away across the ranch to the shaft of the abandoned mine on the hillside, 300 feet deep. The really big event of the week was that McLaughlan engaged a bronco buster to break the 3-year-olds. Ken saw the man first when they were coming down from the stables just before supper one evening, and the bronco buster was standing on the green talking to Nell. He was very small and neat. His legs were thin and bowed in tight blue jeans that were rubbed to light blue inside the thighs and on the seat. His waist was not much larger than Ken's and was belted snug. His small face was bright red and blank looking. His blue eyes were so direct they made other eyes seem shifty. Nell introduced him, just saying that this was Ross Buckley, who was going to ride in the rodeo and had a couple of weeks of free time right now, waiting for the rodeo, and thought he would put it in breaking some horses. "I heard you all had some hot bloods up here," said Ross in a pleasant drawling voice. "Thought I'd like to have a try at 'em, if you've got any that need breaking." Nell said, "Come on, Howard and Ken, time to clean up for supper," and walked away with the boys, leaving McLaughlan there talking to Ross. Ross had arrived in a Ford sedan, piled to the roof with saddles and bridles and blankets and lariats. And when Nell had talked to him and found out what he wanted, she kept him there until McLaughlan came down from the stables. McLaughlan engaged him and took him up to the bunkhouse and introduced him to Gus and Tim. And every day since he had been working in the corral at the Bronx. And in addition to all this, hours had been spent every day looking for Rocket, but no one had seen hide nor hair of her. Ken had not yet been able to decide on his colt. Rocket had her filly hidden away with her in a little valley near the Colorado border. There was deep meadow grass in the bottom, timothy and redtop. There was gamma grass on the sides of the slopes that shut them in. There was, best of all, high clover at the base of the hill above where a spring burst through the ground in a dozen bubbling holes. The water loitered in winding runlets, and at last joined to make a little stream, and the stream made a bed of moist earth for a copse of cottonwoods and aspens. And the shade and moisture made food and cover for a thicket of raspberry and gooseberry bushes and wildflowers, bluebells with yard-long stems as fine as hairs, white Mariposa lilies with pansy dark hearts, and the wild forget-me-not blossoms like tiny seeds of turquoise and lakespur, pink, white, and blue, death to cattle and horses. The filly nosed the lakespur, breathing in its scent, then blew out her breath, snorting, and moved over to the clover and feasted. She stood shoulder deep, green stems and yellow blossoms sticking out on either side of her mouth as she chewed, her head up, looking around contentedly. She had only nursed a few times. Rocket was not so imperative now that the first agony was relieved, and the milk drying up. The 2 horses, Big Black Mare and Little Orange One, grazed side by side in the meadow, and drank at the springs, and cantered on the hillsides, standing now and again on the crests with eyes alert and ears sharply pointed. They were not alone in the valley. In the copse twittered wild canaries and bluebirds. Half a dozen handsome black and white magpies argued noisily in the cottonwoods. A flock of goldfinch swooped across the valley, warbling, swung upwards, circled around and disappeared over one of the hills, only to appear from a different direction and make the round again. Small game moved in the grass. In the sky were a pair of hawks on the watch, and 2 antelope were feeding in the valley, curious and dainty as porcelain figurines. On the day that her foal would have been 9 days old, Rocket cantered up one of the hills and stood at the top, looking over. When the filly came up beside her, the mare bared her teeth and nipped at her. The filly moved away, and Rocket continued her searching of the wind and of the plains. The filly lay down and went to sleep. Rocket made the round of the hilltops at a gallop. On one crest she stood and neighed loudly. It was the northerly outlook that held her eyes the longest. The ranch lay due north. Banner was north. Before evening, she and the filly had left their valley and were working north, pausing to graze and water, not hurrying. It's the end of chapter 11.